The courtroom was tense, every eye glued to the judge as he prepared to deliver his verdict. The silence was so thick, you could almost hear a pin drop. Lawyers shuffled papers, the audience waited with bated breath, and the defendant's family clutched each other nervously, knowing that any word from the judge could change everything. The air was heavy with anticipation. But then, just as the gavel was about to fall, a voice pierced the tension. "I'm hungry." The words came from a young girl, her voice innocent yet sharp enough to break the stillness of the room. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. All eyes turned to her, not quite sure what to make of this unexpected interruption. Was it a joke? A cry for attention? Or something else entirely? The strict, no-nonsense judge, known for his stern demeanor and unflinching authority, paused, his hands still hovering over the gavel. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. The sound of his stern voice had always been enough to keep even the most chaotic cases in check, but this was different. This was a child, a young girl, no more than 10 or 11, standing up in the middle of a trial, demanding food. Her face was serious, a mix of innocence and stubbornness that didn't match the gravity of the situation. She wasn't playing games, nor was she trying to derail the court proceedings. She was simply hungry. But how could anyone in that room, in that moment, ignore the tension her words had caused? The judge, who had faced down hardened criminals and dealt with high-profile cases, now stood frozen, caught between the rules of his courtroom and the simple, honest request of a child. What followed next was something no one in that courtroom could have expected. As the seconds ticked by, the murmurs started. The attorneys exchanged confused glances, the spectators began to whisper amongst themselves, and the courtroom slowly came alive with a low hum of disbelief. How could this be happening? What was going to happen next? Would the judge dismiss the girl's interruption with a stern word, or was there something more at play here? Just as everyone began to settle into an uncomfortable quiet, a curious thing happened. The strict judge, known for being one of the most disciplined and unwavering figures in the legal system, actually did something that no one thought he would. He looked at the girl, then at his court officer, and without a word, motioned for the proceedings to pause. The girl, meanwhile, stood there, brave, confident, and oddly unfazed by the chaos she had just caused. She wasn't like the other children in the courtroom. She wasn't overwhelmed by the grandeur of the room or the formality of the situation. She was hungry, and that's what mattered most to her. No matter the judge. No matter the courtroom drama. No matter the stakes of the case. The judge's response, though seemingly minor, sent shockwaves through the room. Was this a moment of weakness for a man who had built his reputation on his unyielding authority? Or was something more complicated going on beneath the surface? The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thicker as the judge's decision hung in the balance. And just when you thought the tension couldn't possibly rise higher, the girl's simple request, so basic, so human, turned the entire situation upside down. Would the judge give in? Would he scold her, dismiss her, or perhaps even worse, punish her for this unexpected interruption? Or would something entirely different unfold, something that no one could have predicted? As the room fell silent once again, all eyes were on the judge. His decision would not only determine the fate of the case but would also answer the bigger question: could a single child, with a simple request, change the course of a trial, and perhaps the course of a life? Stay tuned as we uncover the rest of this unbelievable courtroom moment, where hunger, innocence, and authority collide in a way that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. The atmosphere in the courtroom had always been intense, but it suddenly shifted when the girl spoke. Her words weren't what anyone expected. The judge, who had presided over countless high-stakes trials, was now faced with a challenge he couldn't have prepared for. The usual protocol for this kind of setting was clear: silence, respect, and strict adherence to the law. But here was a young girl, in the middle of a tense, high-profile case, stating something so simple, so human, that it shook the very foundation of the room. "I'm hungry." Those two words, spoken with the directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to censor her needs or desires, disrupted everything. It wasn't just the words themselves that caused such a stir, it was the timing, the complete absence of fear in her voice, and the boldness to speak up when most would have remained silent. The courtroom, which had been bracing for the next powerful words from the judge, was thrown into confusion. Everyone in the room, from the most seasoned attorneys to the nervous onlookers, had been holding their breath, waiting for the judge to deliver a ruling that could change the lives of those involved in the trial. But now, instead of hearing the gavel fall or the judge's commanding voice, there was a moment of hesitation. The courtroom became a strange mixture of disbelief and tension. What could possibly come next? The judge's gaze, usually sharp and unwavering, softened as he looked toward the young girl. His silence was almost as unsettling as her interruption. For someone who had made a career out of making tough decisions, his indecision now felt out of place. How could he possibly continue after such an unexpected disturbance? The girl, standing in the middle of the courtroom, wasn't looking for attention or trying to disrupt the proceedings. She wasn't aware of the weight of the trial, the gravity of the case at hand. Her world was smaller, simpler, she was hungry, and her hunger needed to be addressed. That was all. But to the people in that courtroom, especially the judge, her words represented something more profound. Was she testing the system? Challenging authority in a place where authority reigned supreme? Or was it something else entirely? The judge, his expression unreadable, nodded toward his bailiff. A ripple of murmurs spread throughout the room as people started to realize what was happening. The child, her request so innocent, was being acknowledged by the judge. But how would the judge respond to something so unexpected? Was this a slip in his usual stoic demeanor? Or was he showing the world that even in the strictest of environments, the simplest of needs, like hunger, could not be ignored? What followed next was a surprising turn of events. The judge, known for his no-nonsense attitude, leaned forward. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the girl. In a calm, measured voice, he addressed her request, not with anger or frustration, but with a surprising amount of empathy. "I'll see what can be done," he said, his voice cutting through the silence that had once again filled the room. The room seemed to collectively exhale. Was this the moment when everything changed? The judge, so often the symbol of order and control, was now responding to a child's need in a way that no one could have predicted. The eyes of everyone in the courtroom were locked on him, waiting for the next move. The attorneys, initially unsure of how to react, exchanged hesitant glances. Some were concerned this delay would affect the outcome of the trial, while others seemed almost relieved by the judge's decision to address the girl's needs. The tension was still palpable, but now, it was mixed with an undercurrent of curiosity. What would the judge do next? The young girl stood her ground, seemingly unfazed by the attention now focused on her. She hadn't meant to become the center of attention, she had simply asked for something every person can understand: food. Yet in doing so, she had unwittingly become a symbol of vulnerability, of human need, and of innocence in a place that often felt detached from those very qualities. As the judge's decision came into play, there was a noticeable shift in the energy of the room. What had started as a dramatic courtroom moment had now become something more, a humanizing interruption that reminded everyone present that no matter how much authority someone held, we all shared basic, fundamental needs. And in a place where so much was at stake, perhaps it was these basic human connections that mattered most. But the story didn't end there. As the judge took action, the atmosphere in the room became even more tense. What would happen next? Would the girl's simple act of speaking up lead to more unexpected consequences? Or was this moment going to fade, as quickly as it had arrived, as everyone moved back into the seriousness of the trial? The room held its collective breath, wondering whether this moment of silence would pass into history as an oddity, or if it would change the course of everything that was unfolding. Would the trial continue as planned, or would this interruption lead to something more dramatic? Could something as small as a child's request for food alter the dynamics of a courtroom in ways that no one could have foreseen? As the judge began to respond, there was no turning back. The story of this courtroom interruption was just beginning, and it promised to reveal far more than anyone could have imagined. Stay tuned to see how the events would unfold, as a simple moment of hunger became the catalyst for a truly unexpected turn of events. What would the judge do? How would the court react? And most importantly, how would this interruption change the lives of those involved in ways that no one could have predicted? The courtroom was unusually silent as the young girl's simple request continued to hang in the air. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to respond. The judge, for all his years of experience, seemed momentarily caught off guard. This was not something he had ever encountered before. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, it became clear that the interruption wasn't just a minor hiccup, it had become a turning point. And no one, not even the judge himself, could predict what would happen next. The judge, known for his stern rulings and unwavering control over the courtroom, was rarely caught off guard. His reputation for being tough and resolute had made him a figure of authority and fear. He was the one everyone turned to when things got out of hand, the one who could silence even the loudest of outbursts with a single glance. But this was different. The girl was not a lawyer making a case, nor was she a defendant pleading for mercy. She was just a child, standing in the middle of a courtroom, hungry and unapologetically expressing it. There was a purity in her voice, an honesty that cut through the layers of formality and tension that filled the room. Her interruption wasn't just about hunger. It was about something deeper. Something that, in that moment, felt more urgent than the legal arguments being made, more pressing than the fate of the defendant, more significant than any ruling the judge might deliver. There was an innocence in her words that somehow made the complexities of the trial seem small and irrelevant in comparison. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "We will address this shortly," he said, turning to his court officer with a subtle nod. The officer, a tall man with a serious expression, moved toward the door, presumably to fetch something for the girl. Meanwhile, the rest of the courtroom remained frozen, still grappling with the unexpected turn of events. No one knew what to do. The lawyers, who had prepared for hours of cross-examination and deliberation, were now at a loss. The spectators, who had come to witness the drama of the trial unfold, sat in stunned silence. Even the defendant, sitting quietly in his seat, seemed to recognize that this moment had shifted the energy in the room. It wasn't just the girl's request that had unsettled everyone, it was the way she had delivered it. There was no hesitation in her voice, no shyness, no fear of the people surrounding her. She spoke as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to ask for what she needed. And in a place where authority and order reigned supreme, her simple, unfiltered honesty was both refreshing and jarring. The judge, meanwhile, sat at the front of the room, his mind racing. He had been in this position countless times, overseeing cases that involved everything from financial fraud to violent crime. He had seen people beg for leniency, heard lawyers make impassioned speeches, and witnessed moments of great emotional tension. But never before had he been faced with a situation like this. Never before had a child's needs interrupted the flow of a trial, forcing him to reconsider what was truly important. His hand hovered over his gavel as he processed the situation. His reputation as a tough, unyielding figure was built on his ability to stay calm under pressure, to make difficult decisions without being swayed by emotion or distraction. Yet here he was, struggling with the simplest of human needs, hunger. As the minutes dragged on, the room seemed to grow heavier, filled with an uneasy anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the judge's next move. Would he dismiss the girl's request and continue with the trial, or would he somehow accommodate her in a way that no one could have predicted? The tension was palpable, and the more it stretched, the more the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would happen next. The girl, standing confidently in the middle of the courtroom, seemed unbothered by the growing discomfort around her. She was hungry, and that was all she knew. The trial, the legal proceedings, the stakes for the people involved, it was all a distant blur to her. She wasn't there to play a part in a drama she didn't understand. She wasn't there to witness a fight between powerful people or to be swayed by the drama of the courtroom. She was simply a child, and in that moment, her world was focused on one thing: food. It was almost as if the entire weight of the situation had no hold on her. The judge's thoughts, though, were in turmoil. He had spent years building his reputation for fairness, for being the one who always had control, the one who made decisions without being influenced by outside factors. But now, in front of everyone, his authority was being questioned, not by the defendant or the lawyers, but by a young girl who had done nothing more than speak her truth. The irony wasn't lost on him. For someone who had spent his life making decisions for others, this was the first time he felt as though his own decisions might be shaped by something other than the law. The clock on the wall ticked, each second seeming louder than the last. The room remained still, the tension in the air thick enough to suffocate. It felt as though the very fabric of the courtroom had shifted, and no one knew how to restore order. Would the girl's request for food be seen as a harmless interruption, or would it be the catalyst for something much bigger? Could this moment truly reshape the course of the trial? The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood of the bench. He had to make a decision. But no matter what he chose, there would be consequences. If he ignored the girl, it would show a lack of empathy, a failure to recognize the basic needs of those in his presence. If he gave in to her request, it could undermine his authority and shift the power dynamics in the courtroom. He had been known as a man of reason, but reason could only go so far in a situation like this. The girl stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze steady. She wasn't asking for much, just a simple response to her hunger. And yet, in this room filled with power, law, and authority, her request had the power to bring everything to a standstill. There was something haunting about the moment, something that seemed to expose the very heart of the judicial system. At its core, the law was meant to serve and protect, but could it truly be about justice when something as basic as hunger could stop it in its tracks? The judge, still lost in thought, gave a slight nod to his court officer, who quickly exited the room. The murmurs from the audience grew louder, whispers traveling from one person to the next. What was happening? Would the trial continue, or was the room about to descend into chaos? The girl stood in the middle of it all, seemingly unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. She was hungry, and the world around her had suddenly come to a halt. The only question now was whether the courtroom would ever be the same again. The courtroom, once a place of strict order, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. As the minutes passed and the judge's silence stretched on, the tension in the room began to escalate. The air was thick with uncertainty. The girl's simple request for food had sent ripples through the courtroom, a moment that, though small in nature, was profound in its impact. It seemed as if time had frozen. People shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure of how to process what had just happened. The judge, a man who had built his career on making difficult decisions in the face of controversy, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of facing a choice that was not at all based in legal doctrine. His usual stern face, one that was known to instill fear and respect, was now conflicted. The courtroom, usually dominated by formalities and legal jargon, had become a place where something as basic as a child's hunger had gained the upper hand. How did one respond to such an interruption? Despite the heavy silence, the girl stood unmoving, her posture confident, as though she were used to speaking her mind and getting what she wanted. But in reality, she had no idea how much she had shaken the foundation of the courtroom. To her, it was simple: she was hungry, and asking for food didn't seem like a big deal. She didn't know how to read the room, and if she did, she probably wouldn't have understood why everyone was so rattled. To her, the world was a simple place where needs were met with answers. But here, in this space filled with authority, she had inadvertently made everyone rethink the very structure of the proceedings. The judge's hesitation was unmistakable. He had dealt with criminals and politicians, and yet now, in the face of a child, he seemed almost powerless. His mind raced through possible responses, each one fraught with consequences. If he ignored the girl, there was no telling how that might affect the dynamics of the trial. If he took her request seriously, it could be seen as weakness, something that could lead to a loss of control, and perhaps even disrupt the delicate balance of power in the room. As the judge stared at the girl, he could see the calm in her eyes. There was no sign of distress, no urgency in her tone. She wasn't asking for attention, wasn't looking for sympathy, she was simply stating a fact. She was hungry. It was a need so pure and simple that it almost made the complexities of the trial seem absurd in comparison. The murmurs of the courtroom slowly grew louder as people began to speculate. Some wondered what the judge would do next. Would he punish the girl for disrupting the proceedings? Would he ignore her entirely, brushing off her plea as irrelevant to the matters at hand? Others whispered among themselves, trying to understand how a single moment could disrupt what was meant to be a carefully orchestrated trial. Had this interruption revealed something more about the nature of authority? Was the judge going to be held to the same human standards as the rest of them? Meanwhile, the court officer returned to the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. It was clear that the judge had given him instructions, though what they were, no one could say. He approached the bench with a small paper bag in his hand, his footsteps almost too loud in the silence. The room held its breath once more, as the officer quietly placed the bag in front of the judge. For a moment, everything stood still. The judge didn't speak. He simply stared down at the bag in front of him. The simple, almost mundane object was a stark contrast to the tension that had built up around it. What was in that bag? Was this truly a solution? Or was it another twist in a story that had already become more complicated than anyone had expected? The girl, standing in the center of the courtroom, seemed unbothered by the attention. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes still focused on the judge. She wasn't trying to make a scene, wasn't drawing attention to herself. She had simply asked for something that felt natural to her. She was hungry. That was all. The judge finally lifted his gaze from the bag and looked directly at the girl. His face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of respect, perhaps, or understanding. But it was brief, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. "You may eat," the judge said, his voice firm but not unkind. His words echoed in the room, and for a moment, no one knew how to react. The quiet that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. It wasn't the silence of respect or the quiet of anticipation, it was the kind of silence that accompanied confusion, a moment where reality itself seemed to bend and warp. The girl, without hesitation, stepped forward and took the bag from the judge's hand. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture. She simply took it, and as she opened the bag, the room waited. What would happen now? How would the rest of the trial proceed? Would this moment of humanity somehow affect the outcome of everything that was to come? In the midst of it all, the defendant shifted in his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he looked on, unsure of how to read the situation. His lawyer glanced nervously at the judge, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this moment of kindness just a temporary distraction, or was it something more significant? The tension that had started with the girl's simple request had now grown into a larger question that no one had answers to. The courtroom staff exchanged worried glances. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had expected a quick, dramatic resolution to the case, not a pause caused by a child's hunger. But what could they say? The judge had made his decision, and no one, it seemed, was in a position to challenge it. As the girl took her first bite from the bag, the eyes of the courtroom were all on her. It was a quiet moment, but it felt monumental. There was no sound except for the faint rustling of the bag and the soft crunch as the girl chewed. She was eating, simple and unhurried, as though the world had stopped spinning and all that mattered was this one small act. But outside of her small world, the drama of the courtroom was far from over. There were still unanswered questions, lingering doubts, and an undercurrent of tension that had only grown more pronounced in the wake of the girl's interruption. What would the judge do next? Would he go back to the trial, as though nothing had happened? Or had the balance of power been forever changed by this brief moment of human vulnerability? The suspense was unbearable. All eyes remained on the judge, the girl, and the slowly unfolding drama. No one knew how it would end, or if it ever would. As the girl finished her small meal, the courtroom remained unnervingly still. Her small act of eating, so simple yet so disruptive, seemed to have done more than interrupt the trial. It had introduced a tension that was impossible to ignore. The air was thick with a sense of unease, as if the room itself could feel the weight of something monumental, even if no one could quite name it. The judge, who had reluctantly allowed this interruption, sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the girl. He hadn't expected this, he hadn't expected any of it. His usual routine of logical decisions and cold calculations had been completely upended. The girl, with her honest request for food, had somehow made him question the very nature of his role in the courtroom. Could he, as a man of the law, remain unmoved by such a basic, human plea? Was it possible that something as simple as hunger could alter the course of a trial, shake the foundations of the judicial system? The courtroom had begun to stir, though the sounds were barely perceptible. The whispers started slow, low murmurs of confusion, concern, and curiosity. How could the judge allow such an interruption? What did this mean for the trial? What was happening to the order that had governed the room for so long? The defendant, who had been seated quietly, now shifted in his seat, visibly uneasy. His eyes flitted between the judge and the girl, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. The lawyers exchanged glances, each one wondering if this was a deliberate attempt to destabilize the trial or if the judge had simply lost control. The defense attorney leaned in toward his client, his voice a barely audible whisper. "What do you think this means for us?" The defendant's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, nervousness, perhaps, or hope. He had been awaiting a ruling on his case for weeks, and now, in this strange and unexpected moment, it felt as though everything had shifted. The trial, once dominated by facts and legal arguments, now seemed to hinge on something far less tangible, an interruption, a child's simple need. The prosecution sat at the table, arms folded, watching the scene with growing frustration. This wasn't part of the plan. They had prepared for this moment for months, meticulously crafting their case. And yet now, with the courtroom in disarray, they were unsure of how to proceed. The prosecutor's sharp gaze lingered on the judge, trying to gauge his next move. Was he losing control? Was he playing into the defendant's hands by letting this small disruption take up valuable time? Or was this some kind of tactical maneuver? The prosecutor's mind raced, but the more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. In the back of the room, a few spectators exchanged uncertain glances, their eyes darting between the girl and the judge. They had come to witness a trial, a fight between justice and the law. But what was unfolding before them seemed like something different altogether. It was as though the very foundation of the trial had cracked, and beneath it, something far more primal had emerged. The girl, with her unspoken honesty, had revealed a truth that no one had expected. The hunger she expressed was more than just a need for food, it was a reminder of the fragility of life, of the basic needs that everyone shared, no matter their station. The judge finally cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We will continue," he said, his words firm but laced with something that almost sounded like hesitation. The court officer had already returned to his position, standing by the door with a stoic expression, waiting for the next instructions. The girl, now finished with her meal, remained standing in the center of the room, seemingly unaware of the shifting dynamics around her. She had asked for food, and she had received it. There was no drama in her actions, no recognition of the impact they had caused. To her, it was as simple as asking for a snack. To everyone else, it had become something far more complicated. Outside the courtroom, the world continued without pause. The day outside was overcast, and the sounds of traffic and city life filled the streets. Yet, in that small, isolated room, it felt as though time had stopped. The case at hand, the trial that had brought so many people together, the high-profile case that was being closely watched by the media, seemed almost irrelevant now. All that mattered in that moment was this small girl, standing at the center of the courtroom, unaware of the ripple effect she had set in motion. The judge glanced at the clock on the wall, his mind still racing. The courtroom had been thrown into disarray by a child, and he had to decide how to regain control. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if the trial itself had become something less important than the human dynamics at play. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about power, authority, and vulnerability, about who had the right to speak, who had the right to be heard. Meanwhile, the defense lawyer, sensing an opportunity, leaned toward his client again. "This is our moment," he murmured, his voice low but intense. "The judge has shown weakness." He let her speak. "We need to use this to our advantage." The defendant nodded slowly, though his expression remained clouded. He wasn't sure what this moment meant. Was it a sign of compassion, or was it a crack in the judge's armor that they could exploit? His lawyer's words were like a spark, but he wasn't sure which direction it would ignite. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was something more unpredictable, more personal. Across the room, the prosecutor was also processing the moment, though his thoughts were less strategic and more emotional. He had seen a lot in his career, cases of greed, corruption, even murder. But something about the girl's interruption had stirred something inside him. It wasn't just a disruption of the trial, it was a challenge to the entire system. A child's hunger had forced everyone to confront their own humanity. How could he continue to argue the law as if it were the most important thing in the room when, in that very moment, something as simple as food had taken precedence? The courtroom had become a battlefield, but not one defined by the usual lines of defense and prosecution. It was a battle for control, for authority, for what truly mattered in a world where the law and human needs collided. And as the judge sat there, trying to gather his thoughts and make sense of the situation, it was clear that this trial was far from over. Whatever direction it took next would be shaped not by facts or evidence, but by the underlying human dynamics that no one had expected to come to the forefront. The girl, oblivious to the growing tension around her, stood quietly, watching as the judge prepared to speak again. Would he return to the case? Or would something else entirely happen, something that no one had anticipated, something that would forever alter the course of the trial? The room waited, holding its breath for what would come next. The courtroom was tense, but no one spoke. The girl stood motionless in the center of the room, almost as though she could sense that her actions had shaken the very foundations of what was happening around her. She was just a child, unaware of the far-reaching consequences of her simple request. Yet here, in this room full of grown adults, she had managed to hold the entire process in suspense. The judge, still seated behind his bench, was lost in thought. His usual confidence had given way to a moment of reflection. He hadn't anticipated any of this. What had started as an ordinary trial, focused on the fate of the defendant, had now turned into a case study of authority, vulnerability, and power. His grip on the proceedings had slipped, but worse, he couldn't help but wonder if he had missed something. Was this about a girl asking for food, or was it something larger? Had the girl become a symbol of everything the legal system had failed to acknowledge? The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from the judge to the girl and back again. He was still trying to process the implications of what had just happened. It was an opportunity, he knew that much. But the question was, what kind of opportunity was it? Was it a way to challenge the integrity of the trial, to introduce doubt into the minds of the jury? Or was it an opportunity to expose the cracks in the system, to argue that even the judge was fallible? It could go in so many directions, but none of them were clear. "Do you think he'll be lenient now?" the defendant asked in a low voice, leaning toward his lawyer. His face was etched with uncertainty, and his hands, though hidden from view, twitched nervously. He had been silent for much of the trial, speaking only when necessary, but now, as the trial seemed to teeter on the edge of something unknown, he had started to wonder about his fate. The girl had interrupted the courtroom, and for the first time, he felt a sense of doubt about what was happening. Was the judge trying to send a message of compassion, or was this just a temporary moment that would be wiped away once the formalities of the trial resumed? The lawyer looked at his client, his face a mask of carefully controlled thought. "It's hard to say," he replied, his voice measured. "We'll have to see how the judge handles this. If he acknowledges it, even just a little, it might shift things in our favor. If he dismisses it and moves on, we might have to rethink our strategy." His words were carefully chosen, but deep down, he felt the weight of the situation. The courtroom had shifted. The case no longer felt like just another battle of legal arguments. It had become something bigger, something harder to define. There were deeper undercurrents at play now, and he knew that both he and his client would have to navigate them carefully if they wanted to find a way out. The prosecution, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, looked as though he were barely containing his frustration. His eyes burned with an intensity that suggested he had already begun crafting his counterargument in his head. How could he use this moment? Could he turn it against the defense, argue that the very presence of this child, and the distraction she caused, was evidence of something larger at play? He had spent years building his case, piece by piece, and now, one small interruption had threatened to unravel it all. But he couldn't let this derail his work. There was too much at stake. Too much to lose. He needed to regain control of the room. His gaze flicked toward the judge, who seemed distant, almost lost in thought. The prosecutor's fingers drummed lightly against the table as he waited for the next move. He wasn't sure what was happening. The situation felt like a chess game, and right now, no one knew which piece to move next. The tension in the room built higher. Everyone was watching the judge, waiting for him to make his next decision. Would he return to the trial, or would this moment of interruption change the entire direction of the day? The girl, who had caused all this, remained still, eyes focused on the judge with a kind of quiet confidence that belied her youth. She wasn't acting out, she wasn't seeking attention, she had simply done what she had needed to do. But that one simple act had transformed the atmosphere of the courtroom. Suddenly, the judge stirred. His hand, which had been resting on the gavel, lifted slightly, as though he was considering something. His fingers tightened momentarily around the handle, as though steeling himself for what was to come. The entire room, in that instant, seemed to hold its breath. He had to address this. He couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, couldn't simply ignore the disruption. But what could he say? How could he balance his duty as a judge with the unexpected, yet undeniable, humanity that had emerged? In the silence that followed, the judge glanced at the court officer once more, giving a small nod. The officer, without a word, turned and exited the room. The decision had been made. But what that decision was remained a mystery. The room remained locked in anticipation, unable to escape the uncertainty that hung in the air. Outside the courtroom, the world continued, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. People went about their daily lives, unknowing of the quiet battle that was taking place over authority and compassion. Cars honked in the distance, the low murmur of street noise filtered into the courtroom, and yet, within these walls, the fate of an entire trial seemed to rest on something that, on the surface, appeared so trivial, so small. The girl, oblivious to the monumental shift she had set into motion, adjusted her position, eyes still locked on the judge. Her stomach, now full, seemed to quiet her for the moment, though her body still carried an alertness, a readiness for whatever would come next. She didn't know the weight of her actions, didn't know that the entire courtroom had been changed by the mere act of expressing her need. To her, it was simply a matter of asking for food. But to everyone else, it was a reminder that life, at its core, was about more than just rules and structure. It was about the simple things, the human things that no one could ignore, no matter how much they tried to. The judge, after what seemed like an eternity, finally spoke. His voice was steady, though there was an underlying tremor, one that no one could quite place. "We will resume the trial," he said, his words carrying a weight that made the room feel heavier. "But I want it understood, there is more to justice than what is written in the law. There is more to what we do here than simply following procedures. We must always remember that." The words echoed in the courtroom. Everyone heard them, but no one could fully understand their meaning. What was he saying? What did it mean for the trial? The girl's simple request had now become a turning point, but for what? Was it a sign of compassion, of humanity breaking through the rigid rules of the court? Or was it a signal that the judge had lost control, that the trial was now out of his hands? No one knew. And as the room lingered in the wake of the judge's words, it was clear that the trial was no longer just about the case at hand. It was about something far more profound. And for all those in the room, the path forward was anything but clear. The courtroom remained charged with an unease that no one could shake off. Even as the judge resumed his position, his words still lingered in the air like a warning, unsettling everyone in the room. There was something in his tone, something deeper, that unsettled the very foundation of the trial. The usual rhythm of legal battles, of back-and-forth arguments, had been replaced by an ominous silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or the subtle clearing of throats. The defense attorney, though outwardly composed, felt a surge of urgency. He had anticipated this trial to be a test of strategy and logic, where he would outmaneuver the prosecution, presenting his case with precision. But now, everything had changed. What had started as a battle of facts and evidence had transformed into something far more fragile, something unpredictable. Could he use the judge's vulnerability to his advantage? Or was he simply getting caught up in the chaos of a courtroom suddenly spinning out of control? The tension that had been building all day now seemed to be closing in on him, tightening like a vice around his chest. His mind raced through his options, but every path he considered felt uncertain. The girl, still standing at the center of the room, was a constant reminder of the question that hung over everything: where did humanity fit into the cold machinery of the law? Could they really just return to business as usual, pretending as if nothing had happened? The simple act of her asking for food had exposed a crack in the foundation. It was a small, seemingly insignificant gesture, but it had shifted everything. Now, as the defense attorney glanced nervously at the judge, he could feel the weight of the moment. The courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The prosecution, too, was starting to feel the pressure. His usual calm demeanor had begun to crack. He had prided himself on his ability to control the courtroom, to dominate every exchange with cold, calculated precision. But now, his mind was full of doubt. How could he fight a battle when the very ground beneath his feet was shifting? The girl's interruption had thrown everything into disarray, and though he could feel the tension mounting in the room, he couldn't quite figure out how to regain control. He glanced at the defendant, then at the judge. Was this a sign of weakness? A signal that the judge, once so unwavering, had lost his grip on the proceedings? The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The air seemed to pulse with unspoken words, with questions that no one dared to ask out loud. The clock on the wall ticked away relentlessly, yet no one seemed to notice. The room was no longer a place of procedure and argument, it was a waiting room for something else, something that no one could predict. Outside, the street noises seemed distant now, muffled by the intensity inside. A low hum of voices had begun to drift from the hallway as onlookers, perhaps curious about the sudden tension in the courtroom, gathered just beyond the door. Whispers began to spread through the building. What had happened? Why had the trial been paused? The girl's interruption was already becoming the talk of the courthouse, and with each passing minute, it felt like the walls of the room were closing in. The girl, for her part, seemed unaffected by the chaos she had caused. She had asked for food, and she had gotten it. Her stomach was full, and her attention was no longer on the people around her, but on the judge, who was now staring at her with a mixture of confusion and thoughtfulness. She had no idea what she had set in motion. To her, it had been a simple act, a small need fulfilled. But to everyone else, it was the spark that had ignited a fire that no one could yet control. The judge's gavel remained still in his hand, his fingers lightly brushing it as though it were a lifeline. The weight of the decision he was about to make was heavy on his shoulders. He knew the room was waiting for him to act, to decide how the trial would proceed. But he also knew that this moment, this strange, unplanned moment, could change the course of everything. The thought that had been slowly creeping into his mind was undeniable. What if justice wasn't just about the law? What if it was about understanding the deeper truths of human nature, of empathy, of compassion? The question weighed on him like an anchor. Could he go back to the cold, rigid logic of the courtroom after what had just happened? Could anyone? The defense lawyer shifted in his seat, trying to get a read on the judge. His eyes narrowed as he observed every small movement the judge made. He could see that the man was struggling. This wasn't just about the case anymore. The girl had forced everyone in that room to confront something more fundamental. The defense attorney's mind spun. Was this the opening he had been waiting for? Was it time to push, to challenge the judge's authority, to test whether this interruption had cracked open something more vulnerable? The thought excited him, but it also terrified him. What if he pushed too far? What if he misread the moment? His client, the defendant, seemed to sense the shift too. His eyes were darting nervously from the judge to the lawyer, waiting for a sign, waiting for some kind of cue that would tell him what to do. His hands, clenched tightly in his lap, betrayed his anxiety. He had been waiting for weeks to hear a verdict, and now, with this unexpected pause, it seemed like the trial was teetering on the edge of something much larger than his fate. But what? What had the girl done? What had the judge decided? Finally, the silence was broken. The judge, his voice calm but edged with an authority that demanded attention, spoke again. I think we've all been reminded today that the law is not the only thing that matters here, he said slowly. But we must also remember that our duty is to uphold justice, regardless of the distractions, no matter how powerful or compelling they may seem. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. He wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. He was speaking to himself. The tension was palpable, everyone on edge, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for him to reveal what would happen next. But just as the courtroom seemed on the verge of finding its direction, the door to the chamber creaked open, and the court officer returned. His face was unreadable, but the look he exchanged with the judge was enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. The officer stepped forward, his hand outstretched, holding a letter. The judge reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly as he took the envelope. There was a moment's hesitation before he broke the seal, eyes scanning the contents. The room held its breath, wondering what it was, wondering if this would be the answer they had all been waiting for. The officer stepped back, and the room waited in complete silence, the tension mounting, with everyone wondering what the letter would say, and what it would mean for the trial. The judge cleared his throat. "It seems," he said, his voice steady despite the tension, "that we have received new information that may change everything." The words hung in the air, like a weight that no one could yet lift. The courtroom braced itself for what would come next, knowing that whatever happened now would shape the outcome of the trial forever. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye was fixed on the judge, waiting for the revelation that would break the silence. The letter in his hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the words within it held the power to unravel everything that had been so carefully built. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room had become suspended in time. The judge unfolded the paper slowly, his gaze scanning the contents. He paused briefly, as if absorbing the weight of what he had read. His brow furrowed in concentration, his lips pressing together as though he were trying to digest something he hadn't expected. The moments stretched on, each second growing more unbearable than the last. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his heart pounding. The prosecution, too, could be seen glancing around, his fingers tapping nervously on the table as he waited for the judge to speak. It wasn't until the judge looked up that the room seemed to exhale in unison. He cleared his throat once more and adjusted his glasses, his face inscrutable. The words that followed were measured, deliberate, too deliberate. "It seems," he began slowly, "that we have been presented with new evidence. This information changes things, how we proceed, what we know, and what we can expect." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was barely audible, but it was there, a sound of confusion, uncertainty, and anticipation. No one knew exactly what the judge meant by that. What new evidence? Who had presented it? And how could it possibly affect the outcome of the trial? The defense attorney's mind raced. What kind of evidence could have come in at this stage of the trial? They were so close to the end, so close to a verdict. Could this be a strategy? Could the prosecution be pulling a last-minute surprise? Or was this something unexpected entirely, something that no one could have predicted? The prosecutor's face betrayed his unease. His usual confidence was faltering. He had expected the judge to dismiss the interruption with a sharp reprimand, to return to the process of the trial without skipping a beat. But now, with this new information, it seemed as though the rules of the game had changed. And if they had changed, the prosecution might be caught off guard. The girl, still standing quietly in the center of the room, was completely unaware of the impact of her actions. She had asked for food, and she had received it. Her simple request had triggered something, though she didn't know what that something was. As the eyes of the courtroom turned back to her, she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her gaze drifting from the judge to the others in the room. To her, this was still just another moment. But for everyone else, it was something much more. "Who brought this evidence forward?" the defense attorney asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Who has made this contribution?" The judge didn't immediately respond. He lowered his gaze to the letter once more, as if to double-check something. Then, without looking up, he answered. "It was submitted anonymously," the judge said. "And it pertains directly to the case at hand." A ripple of confusion swept through the room. Anonymous? How could anyone trust evidence that came without a name, without a face? Could it even be legitimate? Was it possible this was all some elaborate trick, designed to create chaos, to throw off the proceedings? But the judge, seemingly resolved, folded the letter and placed it on his desk, his fingers lingering over the paper for just a moment. He then looked up, his eyes sweeping over the room. "Given the nature of this new information, we are going to suspend the trial for the time being," he declared. "I will be reviewing this evidence thoroughly before proceeding any further." The statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The defense attorney blinked, unable to hide his surprise. The prosecutor stiffened, visibly frustrated. The jurors shifted in their seats, exchanging quiet glances, murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Everyone was left with more questions than answers. What did this evidence contain? Why had it been submitted anonymously? And most importantly, how would it change the trajectory of the trial? As the judge rose from his bench and gave a brief nod to the court officer, signaling the end of the session, a sense of unrest descended upon the room. There was no closure. No resolution. Only an overwhelming uncertainty, hanging thick in the air. No one knew when they would reconvene, or how things would change once they did. The courtroom began to empty, but no one left with a sense of clarity. The case had become a tangled mess of intrigue, and the girl's quiet interruption had created a turning point that no one could have predicted. Outside, the world continued on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in that small courtroom. People went about their daily routines, unaware that inside, the fates of those involved had been thrown into disarray. But in the courtroom, the tension remained. It simmered, just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt again. The defense attorney, now standing and pacing in the hallway, muttered to himself, his thoughts racing. What could this new evidence possibly mean? Was it something that could exonerate his client? Or was it a trap, designed to bring the case crashing down at the final hour? The prosecution, meanwhile, sat alone at his table, his hands clenched tightly together. He was furious, trying to process everything that had just happened. Anonymous evidence? How was he supposed to counter that? How could he even begin to discredit something that was submitted without a name, without any clear origin? In a small corner of the courtroom, the girl stood with her head lowered, her hands clasped together in front of her. She had asked for food, and now everything had changed. The weight of the moment was starting to settle on her. She couldn't understand what had just happened, why the judge had paused everything, why the room had gone silent. But something in her gut told her that the events unfolding around her would affect the outcome in ways she could never have imagined. And as the door to the courtroom closed behind her, the unanswered questions lingered like an open wound. No one knew what the future held. No one knew what the evidence meant. But everyone knew one thing: the trial would never be the same again. The suspense was unbearable, and the only thing that remained certain was the tension that gripped the room. The courtroom may have emptied, but the storm was far from over. As the doors to the courtroom slammed shut behind the last of the departing jurors, the weight of the uncertainty seemed to press harder against everyone's shoulders. The judge's words echoed in their minds: a suspension. An unanticipated break in the trial, the calm before a storm that no one could predict. For the defense attorney, this pause meant an opportunity, an opening to reconsider his strategy, to figure out how to turn this unexpected curveball into something that could work to his advantage. But in the back of his mind, the nagging thought wouldn't go away. How could something so trivial, a girl asking for food, have set off this chain of events? Could that simple action really be the catalyst for everything that was happening now? The prosecutor, on the other hand, was anything but calm. He paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. The anonymity of the new evidence ate at him, a constant reminder that he couldn't control the situation any longer. He prided himself on his ability to predict the flow of cases, to know what would happen before it did. But this was different. The submission of evidence without a name, with no clear explanation, threw everything into chaos. Who would do something like this? And why now? Minutes stretched into hours, but the sense of confusion never lifted. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind only a few officers who made their way to the back to discuss the next steps. Yet, in the quiet, there was something unsettling hanging in the air. Everyone knew that the trial would resume soon, but how could they proceed when no one understood what had truly just happened? The judge had promised to review the new evidence, but his delay only served to heighten the uncertainty. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. Outside the courthouse, the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow that seemed at odds with the storm brewing inside. And then, just as the tension was reaching its peak, the phone rang. It was late in the evening by now. The courtroom was practically deserted except for a few stragglers. The judge, sitting at his desk with the letters still in front of him, picked up the receiver. His expression hardened as he listened intently, his eyes narrowing. Whatever he was hearing wasn't good. The color drained from his face as the conversation went on. A minute later, the judge hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it back in its cradle. He took a deep breath, glancing again at the letter. It was as if everything had changed in that one moment. Everything he thought he understood about the case, about the very nature of the law, was now at risk. His mind raced. There was more to this than just the evidence submitted earlier. There was a deeper connection, something personal, something he hadn't yet realized. The judge stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he walked over to the courtroom's door. The sound was loud in the otherwise still courthouse. He opened the door, his face grim. "Bring them back in," he said to the officer waiting outside. "We're not done here." Within minutes, the defense attorney, prosecutor, and the girl were all brought back into the courtroom. As the door swung open, the air was thick with anticipation. No one knew what had just transpired, but all of them could feel that something was off. Something much larger than what anyone had initially anticipated. As they filed back into the room, the judge motioned for them to take their seats. He placed the mysterious letter in front of him, his hand brushing against it one last time. Everyone in the room was on edge, sensing that the night's revelations were far from over. The defense attorney, as usual, masked his anxiety with a carefully composed expression. The prosecutor, however, looked like he had just been punched in the gut. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes were darting, unable to settle on anything for too long. "Something has come to light," the judge began, his voice steady but full of weight. "New information has surfaced that changes the direction of this trial. I need to make something clear." The room fell into an even deeper silence, the kind that could be felt, almost physically. Everyone, including the girl, who had no understanding of the depth of the situation, felt it. The tension was palpable, as though each word from the judge would either shatter or redeem everything. The judge continued, his gaze moving between the defense attorney and prosecutor. "The evidence presented earlier, it wasn't what it appeared to be." A pause. The room hung on the edge of this revelation, wondering where it would lead. But the judge wasn't finished. This evidence was manipulated, fabricated, even. "Someone has been playing a game with this court." The words hit like a shockwave. The defense attorney's eyes widened, and for a split second, he struggled to form a coherent thought. Fabricated evidence? Who could have done such a thing, and why? The prosecution's face turned a shade paler. He had prided himself on running a tight ship, ensuring the integrity of every piece of evidence that had been presented. But now, this? It was as if the ground beneath everyone's feet had crumbled away, leaving them standing on unstable ground. Who was behind this? Who could possibly have the motive to mess with the very fabric of the trial? And then, the judge revealed the second, even more startling twist. "I know who did this," he said, his voice now filled with a quiet fury. The person responsible for this isn't just an outsider. There's someone in this room. Someone who's been involved in this trial from the start. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke, threatening to choke them all. Who could it be? The defense attorney was already looking at the prosecutor, his mind racing. Could the prosecution be involved in this conspiracy? Or was the defense being framed? The girl's eyes darted back and forth, unable to understand the true weight of what was unfolding, but sensing the danger that loomed just beyond her. The judge's eyes locked onto the defense attorney for a moment, the weight of that stare unspoken, but heavy with meaning. The answer lies within these walls, the judge continued. And before we proceed any further, I need to know exactly who is involved. The clock on the wall ticked, each second louder than the last, as the courtroom waited for the bombshell that was sure to follow. The stakes were higher now. The stakes were personal. And with this revelation, the trial had become something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The lives of those involved were no longer just in the balance, now, their very integrity, their futures, were on the line. The questions mounted. Who was pulling the strings? Who had the power to sway the course of justice? And most importantly, what would happen next? The courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Every person in the room was waiting, holding their breath for what would come next. The judge's last words echoed in everyone's minds. The person responsible for this isn't just an outsider. There's someone in this room. Someone who's been involved in this trial from the start. The gravity of his statement hung in the air, as if the world had come to a standstill. The defense attorney's eyes locked with the prosecutor's. Neither could speak, their gazes tangled in suspicion. The tension between them was palpable, but neither seemed ready to make the first move. The girl stood motionless, her body rigid with confusion. She had no idea what was happening, why the trial was suddenly falling apart, or why everyone was staring at each other with such intensity. Enough, the judge's voice broke through the heavy silence, commanding attention. I'm giving you all one chance to come clean. The truth is out there, and it's time to face it. This trial is no longer about your cases or your clients. It's about something much bigger. The court deserves to know everything. His eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to speak, to deny the truth. The defense attorney swallowed hard, the weight of the situation sinking in. He had known the trial would be difficult, but this wasn't just a legal challenge. This was personal. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking ever so slightly, his mind racing. Was he being implicated in the conspiracy? Was he going to be the scapegoat? He glanced at the prosecutor, whose face had turned an odd shade of pale. The defense attorney began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying again. I'm not the one who did this. I've been doing my job, and I'm doing it to the best of my ability. Before he could continue, the prosecutor slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising with frustration and anger. This is absurd. You think I'm behind this? You're the one who's been hiding things from the very beginning. Don't try to shift the blame. The back-and-forth volley between the two men grew more heated. The girl, standing in the middle of it all, looked between them, bewildered, not understanding the accusations being thrown her way. She had asked for food, that was all. How had she ended up in the middle of this mess? And then, as if a sudden wave of realization struck, the judge's face turned dark. He reached into his desk and pulled out the letter again, the one that had been the catalyst for everything, the one that had turned the trial upside down. This time, his hands were steady. He unfolded it with a calm that sent a chill down the spine of everyone in the room. This letter, the judge began, holding it up for everyone to see, wasn't just about evidence. It was about a threat. A warning. He paused, letting the words settle. Someone here is trying to destroy this trial, to tear it all down. And that someone is you. The courtroom gasped. Every head turned toward the girl, her confused eyes wide as she tried to process what the judge was saying. She had no idea what he was talking about. How could it be her? She was just a girl who had asked for food. There was no way she could have orchestrated this. Was she being accused of something she didn't even understand? But the judge wasn't finished. He looked directly at the prosecutor, then the defense attorney, and finally back to the girl. It wasn't you, and it wasn't either of them, he said slowly, his voice heavy with conviction. The letter wasn't sent by someone in this room. The room fell silent again, the realization dawning on everyone all at once. The true culprit wasn't anyone they had suspected. The letter, the manipulated evidence, the anonymous submission, it was all connected to someone far more dangerous than they had imagined. With one final, chilling statement, the judge revealed the truth. This entire trial has been orchestrated by someone on the outside, someone with power. But it's someone you all know. A stunned hush swept through the room. The prosecutor's eyes widened in shock. The defense attorney stumbled back, his chair scraping across the floor. They couldn't fathom who the judge was talking about. They had assumed the case was about corruption, greed, or personal vendettas, but not this. The girl stood there, still caught in a web of confusion, her heart racing. She glanced between the judge and the others, as if expecting some kind of answer that made sense. But it didn't. Nothing made sense anymore. Who? The prosecutor finally demanded, his voice barely above a whisper, his throat dry. He was grasping for answers, desperate to know who had been behind the scenes all along. The judge looked directly at the girl. She flinched under the weight of his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. But she couldn't. Not yet. The answer, the judge said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, is her mother. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, the shockwaves echoing through the room. Everyone froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. The girl's breath caught in her throat as her world began to tilt on its axis. Her mother? No, that couldn't be right. She wasn't involved in any of this. But the judge's words were firm, unwavering. Her mother, the judge repeated, has been manipulating this case from the beginning. Every piece of evidence, every move made in this trial, was orchestrated by her. And you, he looked back at the defense attorney and prosecutor, were both merely pawns in her game. The girl's mind raced. She couldn't believe it. She had always trusted her mother, had always believed her to be someone who would never hurt anyone. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had never truly understood what her mother had been involved in. And now, it seemed, her mother's shadow stretched far deeper than she could have ever imagined. The room erupted into chaos. The defense attorney stood up, shaking his head in disbelief, as if trying to shake off the accusation. The prosecutor stared at the judge, unable to speak, the horror of the situation slowly sinking in. But amidst all the commotion, one thing was certain, everything had changed. The girl's life, her entire future, was now caught in the crossfire of a war that she hadn't even known existed. And no one knew how it would end, only that the final twist had come too late for any of them to escape. As the courtroom descended into madness, the girl stood in the center, feeling smaller than ever before, realizing that the story was far from over. The final curtain had yet to fall, and the truth, whatever it was, had only begun to surface. The courtroom was now alive with frenzied whispers, the energy palpable as everyone tried to process the bombshell the judge had just dropped. The girl stood frozen, her mind reeling. Her mother? How could it be? Everything she had known, her life, her sense of trust, was shattered in an instant. The walls around her seemed to close in, the noise around her muffled as her thoughts spiraled out of control. The defense attorney, still standing, looked at the prosecutor with wide eyes. This is impossible," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been played. All of us." The prosecutor, who had been silent for what felt like an eternity, finally spoke, his voice tight. "But how? Why would she do this?" His eyes darted toward the girl, but there was no understanding there, only disbelief. "She's just a kid. How could she have been involved in something like this?" The judge let out a sigh, his eyes steady as he glanced down at the letter in front of him once again. "I'm afraid it's not as simple as you think. The girl's mother wasn't just involved, she was the one pulling the strings. She's been orchestrating everything behind the scenes, manipulating the evidence and controlling the flow of information." The prosecutor, his face now pale, sank into his seat. The weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. The defense attorney, however, was still struggling to grasp the full extent of the situation. "But what about the girl? She had no idea, right? She's not involved. She's just caught up in all of this." The judge nodded gravely, his eyes never leaving the girl. "She's a pawn in her mother's game. The girl didn't ask for any of this. But she was being used. Everything she's done, even her simple request for food, was manipulated to trigger the chain of events that led us here." The girl's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces began to fall into place. She had no memory of ever being involved in something so sinister. She had only asked for food in the middle of an intense courtroom session. But her mother had orchestrated this whole mess. And now, everything had spiraled out of control. The judge stood, his voice firm but calm. "The court will reconvene tomorrow morning. There's much to sort through, and we need to ensure that justice is served. But I can assure you that the truth has been revealed, and those responsible will face the consequences of their actions." With that, the courtroom was dismissed. The girl stood motionless for a long moment, trying to understand the enormity of what had just been uncovered. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The people she had trusted most, her mother, the ones who had been part of her life, had played her, used her as a pawn in a game she couldn't even comprehend. As the crowd began to disperse, the defense attorney and prosecutor exchanged a few hurried words. Neither of them had answers, and neither of them knew where to go from here. All they had was the cold reality that they had been manipulated, and now they had to pick up the pieces of a trial that was anything but normal. The girl was left standing there, alone in the middle of the courtroom. She glanced around, half expecting her mother to walk through the door, to explain everything, to make it all make sense. But her mother didn't come. Instead, it was the officer who approached her, a solemn look on his face. "Miss," he said gently, "we're going to take you to a safe place. It's not your fault." She nodded silently, her mind still spinning, still trying to piece together the fractured reality of what she had just learned. She had never felt more alone, more lost, than in that moment. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, the doors behind her swung shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. The trial wasn't over, but it was no longer about the case at hand, it was about uncovering the truth of what had been done. And the consequences of that truth would reach far beyond the courtroom walls. In the days that followed, the investigation into the girl's mother deepened. It turned out that her mother had been involved in a web of corruption, using the trial as a means to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. She had manipulated evidence, threatened witnesses, and even gone so far as to put her own daughter in harm's way, all to achieve her own goals. But now, with the truth revealed, there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. For the girl, life would never be the same. She was left to rebuild her trust in the world, to understand how she had been used, and to come to terms with the fact that her mother was capable of such manipulation. The trial may have ended, but her personal journey was only beginning. The defense attorney, too, had his own reckoning to face. He had been manipulated into believing the false evidence, and though his reputation had taken a hit, he vowed to ensure that the truth came to light, no matter the cost. The prosecutor, for his part, had to answer for his own blind spots during the investigation. Both of them learned a hard lesson: never assume the surface of a case tells the whole story. As for the trial itself, it came to a swift conclusion. With the full scope of the manipulation revealed, the case was thrown out, and the real perpetrators were brought to justice. The judge, whose patience had been tested like never before, made sure that the law was upheld. In the end, the truth was honored, but the scars from the battle would linger. The final twist, the revelation that the girl's own mother had orchestrated the chaos, would be something the public would remember for years to come. It was a story of deception, manipulation, and the lengths to which some would go to achieve their own ends. But it was also a story of resilience. The girl, though shaken, would emerge stronger for having faced the truth. As the dust settled and the media frenzy slowly faded, one thing remained clear: this was a case that no one would forget. It was a story of betrayal and redemption, of a family torn apart by secrets, and of a young girl who learned that sometimes, the people you trust the most can hurt you in ways you can't even imagine. And as for the girl, though the courtroom drama was over, her journey had just begun. She had faced the darkness, and now she would learn to navigate the light.